No.
Mr Chair. Mr Chair, it's been interesting listening to the debate thus far, and I would certainly speak in support of many of the points that have been made by our Labor colleagues about the deficiencies in this bill and the overall direction in which it's going. The chair of our Law and Order Committee, I could say a very good chair too, made the point, and in line with her expectation, it's true the Greens do have a principled objection to the notion of private ownership and management of prisons. We just don't see it as an appropriate thing for the state to delegate that responsibility. The state has a unique right to legally deprive people of their liberty. Our principal position is that we think the state ought to fulfil its obligation by performing those custodial functions. Jackie Dean also made the comment that she thought the Greens and Labor couldn't get their heads around the fact that private management of prisons could be beneficial, and in that she's actually quite wrong. We, I think, would agree that private management can be beneficial. The key question is, to whom does the benefit accrue? And it's very clear that the benefit accrues almost solely to the private operators, to the private contractors. We see no benefit to the taxpayer. We see no benefit in terms of enhanced public safety. We certainly see very little benefit overall to the people working in a prison system and indeed the inmates who are contained within it. There is simply no evidence internationally. The evidence is that on balance we see backward steps. We see more cost over time. Serco's performance, and I'll happily say this outside because it's based on reported evidence, has been suboptimal in many ways, not only in the prison and the corrections, but also in the health service, the National Health Service in UK, for example. Some scandalous performance there. I reject the argument that we must privatise our prisons, which this bill seeks to embed further, simply to get some fresh thinking, some innovative ideas. We do have a corrections department, and I say this in the full awareness that there is some progressive and some good thinking within that department, not least of all from the Chief Exec himself. But overall, I think it's fair to say by observation that the culture of that organisation is very, very inward-looking. It is very defensive. It is not actually conducive to generating or accepting new ideas. That has to change, and that can change over time. But it doesn't change simply by surrendering, by saying the public sector cannot be innovative, cannot create a good and positive and a corrections, a prison environment that actually gives us good outcomes. I would suggest to the Minister that rather than import ownership, rather than import private managers of our prisons, that we temporarily export some of the best and brightest in our public sector, send some of our senior officers on sabbaticals, give them time out from the day-to-day duties, to go overseas, to be exposed to the good ideas, to engage in the debate and to bring back those ideas. This works in education, it works in just about every imaginable field, and it can and should work in corrections. We don't have to import private management. We can send our own people abroad to observe what works, what doesn't work, to bring things back and trial them and look for good solutions. Because the Minister is right in that the corrections system has been moribund for a very long time. As I said, it is inward-looking, it is very defensive, and we need to do better, and I believe we can do better. And I do acknowledge some small steps have been made towards that, but I absolutely reject the proposition that it's necessary to hand over the business to a private operator in order to achieve those better outcomes. I'd like to say a few things about the sections concerning medical officers, Section 8 of this bill. The original drafting left it, there was some doubt under the original drafting that there would be a minimum of one medical officer in each prison. The redrafted version, we are told, assured us that there must be at least one medical officer in each prison, and the language of sufficient number of medical officers is a small improvement, but it's something I think we'll continue to monitor. We know that prisoners routinely have less good health than the general population. There is strong evidence that prisoners' health can go backwards in the terms of Mr. Chair.
David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Prisoners' health can get worse rather than better while they're in the care of corrections. We hear anecdotally of instances, which I hope are not widespread, where access to medical help, medical service is treated as a reward, as a privilege, rather than an absolute right. And these things we know are occurring and ought not to. And I do think that the argument that the Ombudsman presented in the very substantive and comprehensive assessment, the report the Ombudsman gave us last year, advocating very strongly that corrections, the custodial department ought not to have charge of the delivery of health services. And we absolutely agree with that. We think that the mindset, the culture of a custodial organisation is always going to compromise the open and appropriate delivery of health services. It is not only to the benefit of inmates that they get a good health service, it is to the benefit of all of us. 99% of the inmates will ultimately be released back into society. If they remain physically unwell, and we routinely hear of people coming from prison sentences, often quite long sentences, with very poor dental health, with chronic untreated respiratory problems, with all sorts of illnesses that ought to be and could be dealt with better while they're serving their sentences. These people coming back into the communities with ill health, poor physical as well as often poor mental health, untreated addictions and the like, is not helpful for any of us. And it's a shame, as I said last night in the earlier debate, the provisions of this bill we're debating tonight could have been an opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of the health service delivery in our prisons. And it is unfortunate, I think, that there has been some movement around the margins, some changes implemented, but no substantive change. We do need structural changes in our corrections. What we have now is not performing well. We are significantly below par in terms of reoffending, in terms of recidivism, in terms of failure to reintegrate people back into society post-release. We can do better. We need to do better. $1.4 billion last year, and that figure has been climbing year by year by year. We have to do better. It's our responsibility to the taxpayers and indeed to the people who are in the justice pipeline. So I'd like to mention the business of denial to prisoners of their minimum entitlement to exercise. Again, the Select Committee did some good work and we did have a win there that the original drafting of the bill meant prisoners could be denied their minimum entitlement of 1 hour on an open-ended basis. It could go on and on. The new draft of the bill limits that to 2 consecutive days. We still think that's too much, primarily because the criteria include a reference to it not being practicable to provide the opportunity for a prisoner to get an hour's exercise on a given day. In other words, budgetary and resource constraints can deny a prisoner that minimum right. 1 hour out of 24, that is their entitlement, and that can be denied them for 48 hours. What would it do for any of us to be confined in very small rooms, the back of a prison van, a holding cell at a court, back to a cell in a prison, 48 hours on a stretch without seeing daylight, fresh air? It would, even if I dare suppose that most of us are well-balanced individuals, I think we would find ourselves seriously stressed by that. For a person, an inmate who's already suffering stress, including people not yet proven to be guilty of anything, because this applies to remand people as well, I think it's unacceptable that we should deny that very, very minimal 1 hour entitlement per day to some exercise. And I think that is it's simply not good enough. We should not be reducing what is already a very minimal entitlement. It's simply inhumane to keep people confined to that extent for 48-hour periods, then perhaps a day with a 1 hour exercise, and then back to court for another couple of days or transferred to another prison, whatever the situation might be. There's been talk already, the reference made to the question of strip searches, the extent to which the more intrusive form of strip search will become the norm rather than allowing for the less intrusive version. And I do think that that is something that often when one speaks in any detail of this, people wrinkle their noses. It's not a prison business. The point's been made. It's been articulated already. It's not desirable for inmates nor for staff.
Asanati Lole-Taylor.